very next words would be, the disciples ask him about the parable of the wheat and the tares, or the tares of the field. This is Matthew 13:36. I used the first half. Then Jesus sent the multitude away and went into the house. And then I jumped back to verse 10, and the disciples came and said to him, but I mixed that with Mark and Luke. So the second half of this verse, and his disciples came to him saying, it's similar wording, but it actually is a different verse, so I can continue right there. This explanation is not in Mark or Luke. This is only Matthew, so all this has to be Matthew. And his disciples came to him saying, declare to us the parable of the tares of the field. He that sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, but the tares are the children of the wicked one. The harvest is the end of the world. As therefore the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so shall it be in the end of the world, and shall cast them into a furnace of fire. Then shall the righteous shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Who has ears to hear, let him hear. Then he goes on again, the kingdom of heaven is like to treasure hidden in the field. He gives that parable. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like to a merchant seeking goodly pearls. He gives that parable. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like to a net that is cast into the sea. He gives that parable. After that, I'll put the last from Mark and Luke. So I'll continue with all these. This is verse 44. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like to treasure hidden in a field. Sells all that he has and buys that field. Like to a merchant man seeking goodly pearls, sold all that he had and bought it. Like to a net, so shall it be at the end of the world. There shall be wailing, gnashing of teeth. Now I have a question, because the next verse is, Jesus said to them, have you understood all these things? They say to him, yea, Lord. Then said he to them, therefore every scribe which is instructed to the kingdom of heaven is like to a man that is a householder, which brings forth out of his treasure things new and old. That's where it ends. But I know that I have other parables to add, so should I put them before Jesus asked the question? I know I have to add, is a candle brought to be put under a bushel or under a bed, and not to set on a candlestick? Then the principle of he who has will be given more, he who has not, even what he has will be taken from him. Then the parable of the sower, where God brings the increase. You know, I think I want to finish with these verses here before I put the verses from Mark and Luke, because I am not sure if there's some hidden meaning that I don't know of right now, where this last statement he makes, every scribe which is instructed to the kingdom of heaven is like a man that is a householder, which brings forth out of his treasure things new and old. Maybe that has some meaning to what just came before, and I wouldn't want to separate them if that's the case, because that statement is not in Mark or Luke. So I'll finish with that, then I'll put the other parables from Mark and Luke. Jesus says to them, have you understood all these things? Yea, Lord. Therefore, every scribe which is instructed to the kingdom of heaven is like to a man that is a householder, which brings forth out of his treasure things new and old. The disciples are now asking him to explain the parable of the tares of the field. In Matthew 13:36, and his disciples came to him, saying, "Declare to us the parable of the tares of the field." However, this is the second explanation after the parable of the sower is explained. And I have these put together now. It's not put together in Matthew because he gives one parable and then an explanation, then another parable, another explanation. But I guess I don't have to re-explain why I decided to put the parables together and then the explanations together. But because of that, there are two verses that explain the disciples coming to Jesus and asking for an explanation, which is not really necessary if all these explanations are done at one time. The reason why that's important is because if Jesus already gave the explanation and they're all gathered together and it ends with these words, "Bring forth fruit with patience, some 30-fold, some 60, and some 100-fold." The very next verse is, "And his disciples came to him, saying, Declare to us the parable of the tares of the field." Except that doesn't really make any sense. Why are they coming to him again? They're already in the house getting the explanation. Jesus is speaking to them privately. They're not leaving and coming back. But those words are sort of necessary because Matthew goes back to the next parable, the way that he portrays it all. And then they come together, and he has to say they came to him. Even though it says that already in Matthew 13:10, and the disciples came and said to him, "Why speakest them in parables?" And then he explains the parable. Since there are two verses saying the disciples are coming to Jesus and asking him for the explanation, but I only need one, then words I use from either should be accessible to this one situation. So that works out perfectly because saying his disciples came to him saying, "Declare to us the parable of the tares." Came to him is unnecessary. Saying is also unnecessary because that would have to be after they arrived. They're already there. If I could replace saying with said, it would be perfect. And his disciples said to him. I could replace saying with said and then move said to where the word came is. It would fit perfectly. And with the background that I just gave, these two verses that explain that the disciples are coming to Jesus asking for an explanation, in verse 10 and verse 36, if I can use those two verses at once to explain that the disciples came to Jesus, both times where it says his disciples came to him would only be at the beginning, but then in the earlier verse where it says, "and said to him," I could use that said here, because I use his disciples that were about him with the 12 came and asked of him the parable. Now that word came here, I say it's from Matthew 13:36 CD. So it's the second verse where it says the disciples came. I could change that, and I think I actually will change that to both. And I use "and asked of him." Saying I use from Luke. If I'm not going to use that in 36, I can change this to orange so that it's from both Matthew and Luke. This came, I'll say, would be 1310 AD. and 1336 CD. But the important part is that in verse 10, I don't use anywhere the word said. And the disciples came and said to him, why speak you to them in parables? Which is just perfect for the situation I wanted to fix. I used saying, came, I used that already, and I'm going to replace that with said from verse 10. And just to make it clear that I'm doing something interesting, I'll put a space, empty color for the highlight around that word. So now it reads, and his disciples said to him, declare to us the parable of the tares of the field. Which makes perfect sense. If they're all in the house, Jesus just explains to them one parable, and now they're just asking him, now explain the next one. His disciples said to him, they're not going to leave and come back. They're probably going through all these explanations at one time. It would make sense that they would just move right into asking what the next parable means instead of leaving and coming back. But I guess you could say that I'm grabbing a word from really far away to put in these verses so that it fits my understanding of what's going on. But if you take into account the fact that all these events in chapter 13 and some even earlier, some of chapter 12, all happen in one day, and that it doesn't make sense for Jesus to dismiss the crowds twice and call them all back again, then it makes perfect sense for at least part of verse 10 and part of verse 36 to be the same event, the exact same event, just said two different times, for the explanations to be immediately after the parables, for the readers to more easily understand. So I'm not really reaching too far. These two verses are talking about the same thing. The meaning has not changed.